Hey everyone, it's Austin back with another video for Human Ideals. I know it's been a really long time since I released content for this channel. I'm really sorry about that. It's been about 9 months or so, which is a really long time to be absent from a YouTube channel. But if you haven't already, be sure to check out the interview I did with Joshua Chang and in one video, and Christopher St. Lauren over in his interview at the Unspirituality YouTube channel. With him, I went into debunking a lot of the misconceptions in New Age spiritual circles. That was fun, coming from his own biospiritual path, as well as my individual insights as a spiritual seeker. But anyways, to give you a picture of the future of this channel, I've actually been planning to start Human Ideals as a spiritual activism movement on campus at USC. Trying to gather a team of spiritual seekers like myself to connect spirituality with social change, given the few social movements and initiatives that we have at school, regardless of whether they are engaged in spirituality to the same extent that I'd like them to be, is something I'll have to wait and gauge. But in the meantime, for this spiritual activism movement, I've been planning to put together an action trailer / highlight reel for what this movement is going to stand for. So that'll be really exciting. Be sure to check that out when it's released. But in the meantime, I decided to share another interesting piece of content that I wrote while I've been on campus. So last semester, I actually took this environmental studies course called Environmental Issues in Society. And in this class, I got to apply a lot of the metaphysical frameworks that I've learned from teachers like Leo Gura over at actualize.org, with regards to paradigms like systems thinking, spiral dynamics, integral ecology, and another one called Delta Theory, which I dived into, but we'll get into that. So anyways, this paper is about integral ecology, or more specifically, integral ecological activism, and how it plays into the negotiating strategies of UN officials and the Sustainable Development Goals, and how that has progressed or can progress over time with different states of consciousness or psychosocial values. And I thought this was relevant, especially with all the talks surrounding the Green New Deal with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as well as some similar bills released by her rivals like Joe Biden with his own Green New Deal bill. So that's really interesting to see. I'm really looking forward to how that plays out. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy this paper that I wrote called Towards an Integral Ecological Activism. The image of environmental activism is often divided between protest and policy reform. Although there are merits to both approaches, their promotion of sustainability lacks an essential element of social impact, the act of integration. Citizens may disrupt unsustainable practices, laws, or extraction efforts in their communities without ever influencing the values of those in power, the minds of lobbyists, politicians, and corporate executives, each with their own economic incentives. Likewise, international policies may not translate to mitigative or adaptive solutions on a local scale, as negotiations are often delayed by opposing national agendas. Integration is simply the process of reconciling worldviews, views that are regarded as being mutually exclusive. It is the inspiration behind integral ecology, a paradigm developed by transpersonal psychologist Ken Wilber. This theory states that all ecological problems arise from disharmony between our subjective and objective relationships to the environment. It relates to the evolution of our psychosocial values and approaches to conflict resolution, as illustrated in the frameworks of systems thinking, spiral dynamics, and delta theory. This extends to the wide range of political and ethical leanings amongst world leaders. A more effective integral promotion of sustainability and integral ecological activism would synthesize and evolve their leanings along the progressive stages of said frameworks, optimizing their subjective and objective relationships to the environment through policy reform. This lack of integration can be seen in the histories of environmental norms, ethics, and international negotiations. The most prominent division in environmental ethics stems from a debate on the instrumental versus inherent value of the environment. Those who argue for the instrumental or utilitarian value of the environment claim that natural resources should be valued solely for their contributions to human survival. On the other hand, those who argue for the inherent or intrinsic value of the environment claim that natural resources should be valued solely on the basis of their existence, similar to Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. Since the valuation of resources indicates both a subjective and objective relationship to the environment, as illustrated by Wilber's integral ecology, this debate can be subdivided into preservation versus conservation ethics. Preservation ethics, most notably advocated for by John Muir, asserts that the environment should be protected in its natural state, free from all human activities including farming, industrialization, urbanization, and so forth. However, conservation ethics, as propounded by Gifford Pinchot, supports the right to use natural resources on the condition of being sustainably maintained for future generations, also known as the concept of sustainable development. This is outlined in the Stockholm Declaration of 1972, which states that countries have the right to utilize all resources within their own national jurisdiction, provided that no environmental damage is caused to all countries outside their jurisdiction. From there, the tension between instrumental versus inherent value, as well as that between preservation and conservation ethics, can be further divided into the views of anthropocentrism, the valuation of resources according to human needs, biocentrism, the valuation of all living organisms, and ecocentrism, the valuation of all interactions between living and non-living systems as a whole. In the absence of integral awareness, fallouts between countries may seem irreconcilable in world politics. For instance, negotiations on the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, involve disputes between different countries in the United Nations, each with their own political leanings. This process was shaped in accordance to two key principles. 1. Building a green economy in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. And 2. Defining the institutional framework for sustainable development. Progressive nations such as France, Sweden, Germany, and Guatemala asserted that the SDGs should finalize targets in the existing Millennium Development Goals while trying to expand upon them. However, conservative nations including China, Kenya, and Nepal argued that the SDGs should take a more traditional approach to development, suggesting greater focus on economic growth and poverty reduction while being more limited in their scope of social issues. New principles, which included the cooperative reduction of climate change, promotion of clean water and sanitation, and the building of more resilient infrastructure, among others. Ultra-conservative nations took this stance even further. Countries including Saudi Arabia, Bangladesh, and Uganda sought to significantly limit the SDGs, especially in cultural controversies such as LGBT rights and in preserving their fossil fuel-dependent economies. This process amounted to disharmony between the experiential, behavioral, cultural, and systemic dimensions of integral ecology, the four quadrants of Ken Wilber's AQAL, or AQUAL, model. These tensions were then shaped by the more fundamental influence of ethical leanings. Negotiations on a green economy in the SDGs, prioritizing sustainable development and poverty eradication, mirrored the instrumental versus inherent value debate on the environment. Since progressive countries placed equal emphasis on sustainability and economic growth, their argument challenged the mutual exclusivity between instrumental and inherent value. The former assumed that valuing natural resources for human survival barred countries from valuing the sheer existence of their environment, similar to the stance of preservation ethics. However, the latter assumed that valuing the environment prevented countries from utilizing their natural resources. This assumption was deconstructed in conservation ethics, by arguing that natural resources could be used and maintained for future generations, conservation ethics cater to both emphases in the Sustainable Development Goals. However, as the negotiations shifted more towards conservative countries, arguments in favor of this exclusivity became more apparent. Although sustainability was not completely diminished, the importance of economic growth reduced its emphasis in the SDGs, fueling the tension between instrumental and inherent value. Ultra-conservative nations then solidified this exclusivity in their purely anthropocentric concern for fossil fuel production, rejecting all biocentric and ecocentric ethical values. These varying exclusivities can be seen as differences in the cultural and systemic quadrants of integral ecology, manifesting in different combinations for each of the three political leanings. The cultural quadrant takes the perspective of second-person intersubjectivity, encompassing shared ideologies, worldviews, group values, religious views, and so forth, while the systemic quadrant takes the perspective of third-person interobjectivity, marked by shared institutional, political, or economic environments. Both progressive and conservative countries express support for a green economy, aligning their views in the systemic quadrant. However, the latter believed in compromise between sustainability and economic growth, and their anthropocentric conservation ethics distanced them from progressives in the cultural quadrant. Ultra-conservative countries, having rejected the green economy altogether, diverged from these two leanings in both the cultural and systemic quadrants of integral ecology. Ecology, in this case, can be defined as, quote, the scientific study of the interactions among organisms and of the relationships between organisms and their environments, end quote. This definition coincides with the intersubjective and interobjective relationships above, aptly named we and its, respectively, in the Ecological model. However, the role of individual organisms means that the experiential and behavioral dimensions of this process must be addressed. These individuals were none other than the various subgroups and representatives within the United Nations, including the Open Working Group, the General Assembly, the Secretariat, contact groups, the Secretary General, presidents, ministers, delegates, and others. The evolving conflict resolution between them enabled the full integration of environment ethics in the SDGs. This process can be illustrated through the framework of spiral dynamics, a model of cultural evolution founded by Claire W. Graves, further developed by his successors Don Beck and Christopher Cohen. Each of its 9 stages are adaptations to the limiting life conditions of previous stages, oscillating between individualist and collectivist approaches to conflict resolution. The stages, in order of increasing complexity, are beige, survival sense, purple, kin spirits, red, power gods, blue, truth force, orange, strive drive, green, human bond, yellow, flex flow, turquoise, global view, and coral, chaos avatars. The monikers of these colors classify the individualist stages as beige, red, orange, yellow, and coral, with the collectivist stages being purple, blue, green, and turquoise. This difference refers only to the conflict resolution styles of individuals in the UN, not the individualist, experiential, and behavioral or collectivist, cultural, and systemic quadrants of the Ecological model. As such, UN individuals may have acted from any of the 9 stages, each representing a change in the experiential and behavioral dimensions of integral ecology. During the 2015 UN Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen, also known as COP15, their disputes on the SDGs mirrored the conflict between stage orange and green in the spiral. Delegates from developing countries felt that, quote, developed countries were aiming to slow their development, using climate change and green economy as the tools, end quote. Their suspicion of ecocentrism, the ethics espoused by developing countries' delegates, reflected the achievement and competition-oriented values of Stage Orange, as illustrated in their anthropocentric focus on development. Quote, under Code Orange, the individual achieves status and affluence through competition and seeking best solutions. Free markets, the rise of industrialization and corporations, democracy, and empirical scientific research flowed from this new code. End quote. This ecocentrism did align with the egalitarian values of Stage Green. However, the lack of transparency through the COP15 showed that even delegates from developed countries were still influenced by stage orange competitiveness. Quote, negotiations moved behind closed doors with only a few friends of the chair or members of a contact group convened by the presiding officer at the highest political level invited to attend. End quote. This implies that the tension between stage orange and green individuals in the UN was, in fact, the difference between competitive and cooperative approaches to conflict resolution, not a matter of anthropocentric versus ecocentric ethics. In terms of integral ecology, the experiential dimension encompassed the stage orange values of competition, industrialism, and empiricism, as well as the stage green values of egalitarianism, humanism, and environmentalism. These values affected the behavioral dimension in the level of transparency present throughout the negotiations. In other words, stage orange delegates limited transparency to their advantage, much to the frustration of stage green delegates. Quote, prime ministers were sitting around waiting for the smoke to come out of the chimney, noted one delegate, comparing the secret meetings to a papal conclave. The lack of transparency at stage orange and green means that the conflict between UN individuals must be resolved from a higher stage, also known as stage yellow. This stage marks the beginning of what Don Beck calls second-tier being consciousness as opposed to first-tier subsistence consciousness, represented by stages green and below. The moniker flex flow refers to its ability to acknowledge and synthesize multiple perspectives. This is often done through systems thinking, a framework of conflict resolution outlined in the book Systems Thinking for Social Change by David Peter Stroh. Two key principles of systems thinking state that the relationship between problems and their causes is indirect and not obvious, and that we unwittingly create our own problems and have significant control or influence in solving them through changing our own behavior. Throughout the COP15 negotiations, these principles were expressed through system archetypes, each representing different limiting patterns or vicious cycles in the conflict between UN individuals. The most prominent archetype was that of accidental adversaries, a scenario in which the actions of an individual aimed at their own success limit the success of another individual through a negative feedback loop, and vice versa. This was illustrated in the resistance of delegates from developing countries to the green economy. By imposing sustainable development, delegates from developed countries ensured the competitiveness of their own economies at the expense of economic growth in developing countries. The restriction of transparency in closed-door negotiations also reflected accidental adversaries, as this action delayed the SDGs for all UN individuals. Regarding the first principle of systems thinking, the conflict between these individuals seemed to be caused by the difference in environmental ethics, one attributed to the tension between stage orange and green. Upon further inspection, this conflict actually resulted from the difference in competitiveness between the two stages, and that this was the true cause of transparency issues in the COP15. Similarly, the second principle shows how the delegates actually had control over increasing their transparency. In terms of the behavioral dimension, delegates from developing countries could have persuaded their developed counterparts to provide subsidies for sustainable development. Systems thinking can also be applied to the SDGs themselves. Since the SDGs were founded on the emphases of sustainable development and poverty eradication, the issues most pertinent to them would include climate action and productive employment. For instance, hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, is a human activity that matches with the archetype shifting the burden. It depicts a scenario in which the execution of a quick fix masks a more fundamental solution to the issue at hand. This can be seen in the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or ANWR, in Alaska, continues to engage in fracking for shale oil and natural gas. Their most common justification is that it provides stable job opportunities across the country, maintaining economic growth as the transition to renewable energy overcomes its setbacks. Quote, with the increased emphasis on fracking, some of the most depressed parts of the United States now have unemployment rates below 1%, providing high-paying jobs to thousands of workers. Of course, a current limitation of renewable sources is their low energy return on investment, or EROI. per volume compared to that of fossil fuels, sources that are being supported by more and more efficient extraction technologies. However, the high investment needed for such technologies, based on the justification of a stable transition to clean energy, masks the fundamental solution of more efficient and potentially less costly renewable technologies. Shifting the burden also applies to poverty eradication regarding the types of jobs that should be in demand. In this case, the expansion of fracking jobs masks the solution of creating new green jobs. With that said, the cost of funding occupational retraining programs nationwide may dissuade UN individuals and their respective governments from implementing these solutions. This is the limiting life condition of stage yellow. When systems thinking no longer promotes sustainable policy reform, largely from its confinement to the experiential and behavioral dimensions of integral ecology, it must transition to a higher collectivist stage in the spiral, also known as stage turquoise. The moniker global view reflects its ability to, quote, see the self as both distinct and a blended part of a larger compassionate whole in which holistic, intuitive thinking and cooperative actions are to be expected in order to sustain all life, end quote. Judging from this description, the UN may already be a turquoise organization in the negotiation between individuals. However, the conflict in environmental ethics and transparency between them prevents the emergence of a functioning turquoise collectivism, further illustrated in the clash between stage orange and green values. In integral ecology, this range of political and ethical values in the UN pertains to the cultural dimension, the sum total of all human ideas and perspectives around the world. This global network is called the noosphere, defined as, quote, a process of an increasingly complex intermeshing of cognitive realms within the biosphere, an unfolding of individual and collective ideas, mentalities, aspirations, and experience. In any given issue on sustainability, the noosphere is influenced by two phases of change. The first phase involves the act of ideation, where humans decide how and why they are going to affect the environment. For instance, slash-and-burn agriculture is often executed for the prospects of urbanization or grazing for livestock. The second phase describes the physical actions and consequences of this ideation. In slash-and-burn agriculture, the act of cutting and burning plants for new crops would lead to soil erosion, the degradation of soil due to its removal and transport by wind or water. This would be the second noospheric phase, as it describes the physical consequences of ideation. In the Biosphere and Noosphere Reader, geologist Charles Lyell argues that ideation is less significant than physical action, since the level of change it creates depends on prior environmental conditions. This means that soil erosion would be determined by the severity of existing streams and winds, more so than the prospects of slash-and-burn agriculture. The way to reduce erosion would thus be to not only limit this farming practice, but to pursue urbanization and grazing efforts in areas with less severe conditions. The weight of physical circumstances, actions, and effects over ideation applies to another turquoise concept called Gaia Theory. The Gaia hypothesis states that organisms interact with the Earth's biosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, and soil, creating a system of feedback loops that regulate the environment to sustain life. This regulation is known as homeostasis, quote, the tendency of a system to maintain constant or stable internal conditions. James Lovelock, the originator of Gaia theory, outlined many possible relationships between organisms and the system. In coevolutionary Gaia, organisms share a symbiotic or mutual relationship with their abiotic surroundings, where life-sustaining conditions help to preserve the environment. The environment then places constraints on said organisms, dictating their evolution through natural selection. Homeostatic Gaia describes a relationship where organisms and their environment interact as negative feedback loops, regulating the Earth's conditions in an ecocentric rather than a biocentric manner. Lastly, optimizing Gaia illustrates a dynamic where living organisms, through biological processes such as respiration, deliberately maintain life-sustaining conditions in their environment, conditions including temperature, pH levels, and soil nutrient profiles, among others. Out of all three relationships, homeostatic Gaia represents the typically negative consequences of ideation as seen in slash-and-burn agriculture, whereby ideation is the pursuit of survival. It is also the only relationship where existing environmental conditions do dictate the consequences of ideation. The more environmental protection is present, the less life-sustaining conditions organisms maintain in their ideation of survival. This cannot be said for the two other relationships representing positive consequences of ideation. Due to their biocentrism, existing environmental protection has little bearing on the amount of life-sustaining conditions organisms maintain. This means that a functioning turquoise negotiation forum, a forum such as the UN, would analyze sustainability issues according to these noospheric relationships. The ethical values of each UN individual, based on their anthropocentric, biocentric, or ecocentric leanings, would determine which of these relationships are favorable, placing their decisions in the context of system archetypes. Even with these relationships, turquoise collectivism can be limited by conflict between individuals. This calls for the transition into a higher individualist stage in spiral dynamics, also known as stage coral. In collaboration with Beck, future philosopher M.A. Carano was the first to discover this stage, giving it the moniker chaos avatars. The term reflects coral individuals' ability to use chaos to their advantage, causing significant change to a system with the least amount of leverage. Quote, spawned in the cutthroat life conditions of virtuous synergies, chaos avatars emerge to defy the planetary holism of delicately balanced, artfully synthesized systems. By seizing control over the trajectory of its own evolution, chaos avatars seek to dominate and destroy the vicious cycles that would seek to constrain their excesses. End quote. Carano lists these 5 principles as laying the foundation of stage coral. 1. Trusting the chaos of one's environment, intervene in a system with just enough force for a limited amount of time. This will prevent a dependent, subordinate relationship in the system towards oneself. 2. Before intervening in a system, set up a safeguard of balancing feedback loops. This will prevent the negative effects of the system's vicious cycles. 3. Identify, isolate, then utilize the leverage points in one's environment that will cause maximum change to the system with minimal effort. 4. Create the environment that will actualize the full potential of one's conscious evolution. And 5. Set up disinformation campaigns that will counteract the deception of actors competing for systemic dominance. These principles affect negotiations according to their method of intervention and the spiral dynamic stage of individuals involved, thus relating them to the transparency conflict between stage orange and green, the vicious cycles of stage yellow archetypes, and the conflict in noospheric relationships for stage turquoise. The way coral thinkers affect relationships between these individuals ties into the ideas of Delta theory, a framework of psychosocial influence similar to stage yellow, with the added complexity of coral chaos. Roland G. Tharp, author of Delta Theory and Psychosocial Systems, argues that psychosocial systems are the mediums through which influence occurs, defining them as, quote, affiliated persons organized into systems that share values, purpose, and activity. This influence is categorized into 4 aspects of interaction known as the cycle of social sorting. 1. Promiscuity, or the physical proximity between individuals. 2. Joint activity, the act of working towards a shared objective. 3. Intersubjectivity, or the cultural dimension of integral ecology. And 4. Affinity, the mutual inclination towards relationship and cooperation. These aspects are then played out differently in the 3 phases of change, beta, alpha, and delta. Quote, the beta phase is one of behavioral and social equilibrium and stability. The alpha phase is characterized by disequilibrium and instability. The delta phase is organized for enhancing influence and change. For instance, during the COP15 negotiations, the Millennium Development Goals maintain harmony between progressive, conservative, and ultra-conservative nations in their emphasis on economic growth, thus corresponding to the beta phase. However, as the SDGs were proposed, delegates from developed countries started pushing for sustainable development, and the resulting transparency issues between stage orange and green delegates corresponded to the alpha phase. Finally, the resolving of transparency issues through systems thinking marked the transition into stage yellow, demonstrating enhanced influence through the delta phase. In other words, the beta phase describes the equilibrium of a spiral dynamic stage, the alpha phase describes the disequilibrium caused by conflict between this stage and its predecessor, and the delta phase describes the opportunity for greater influence in shifting to a higher stage. The cycle of social sorting can also be applied to this example. Propinquity describes the close proximity of delegates in the UN, whether it be through open or closed-door meetings, joint activity, the drafting of the SDGs themselves, intersubjectivity, the shared ethical values between delegates, and affinity, the willingness to cooperate and increase proximity from these values. Hypothetically, choral thinkers would exert leverage on all four aspects to kickstart transitions between the beta, alpha, and delta phases. This would force individuals to rise up the spiral dynamic stages, eventually having them enact sustainable policies based on choral principles. For instance, the fifth principle could be applied against corporations notorious for anti-sustainability initiatives. The Western States Petroleum Association once ran a disinformation campaign criticizing the supposedly hidden California gas tax. Although they expressed concern for the working class, their campaign was driven by the fear of lost revenue from declining gasoline demand. A counter-disinformation campaign that innovators like Elon Musk could run is to market a new hyper-efficient hybrid car. Its main selling point could be a higher gas mileage, a feature that would restore the lost demand for gasoline. This would mask the true motive of marketing this car, to increase demand for an upcoming lineup of fully electric, sustainable automobiles. Here, the beta phase corresponds to the stage green values of sustainable innovators. When these values are disturbed by the disinformation of stage orange fossil fuel companies, corresponding to the alpha phase, innovators transition into the higher stages of yellow or even coral thinking by countering this disinformation. Regarding the four aspects, propinquity would be manipulated by distancing said companies from the working class, joint activity by creating the electric car, intersubjectivity by marketing stage green values to the working class, and affinity by fostering loyalty to the sustainable brand and away from fossil fuel companies, thereby reinforcing the distance in propinquity. The birth of an integral ecological activism is ultimately a process of reconciling and expanding upon environmental values which may stand in opposition to one another. This tension starts from differences in environmental ethics, where the exclusivity or perceived exclusivity between instrumental and inherent value, preservationist and conservationist ethics, or between anthropocentrism, biocentrism, and ecocentrism, is reduced to the choice between mitigative or adaptive solutions to sustainability. The conflict between UN nations and individuals over the SDGs showed the difficulty of deeming such ethics as being solely exclusive or non-exclusive, as this is subject to change according to their political leanings. Ken Wilber's AQUIL model provided a template of reconciliation based on the experiential, behavioral, cultural, and systemic dimensions of integral ecology, but it alone could not overcome limitations in their conflict resolution strategies. The frameworks of systems thinking, spiral dynamics, and delta theory showed that as these stages or strategies grow in complexity, the ability to manipulate both ecological and psychosocial interactions also increases, reducing obstructions to sustainable policy reform on a local and international level. The main takeaway from these frameworks is that the issue of sustainability is not so much limited by mitigative or adaptive solutions, a false dichotomy in and of itself, as it is by the absence of high-leverage interventions and the elevation of values in parties with less complex conflict resolution strategies.